Everyone treats summer like it owes you happiness. Long days, pool parties, your best life on a loop. So what does it mean when you feel worse? The summer blues are real. It's why summer is one of the busiest stretches of the year for people starting therapy. Therapy is not only for when you're in crisis. Growth therapy is for all the moments when you decide you want more. More support, more clarity, more tools. Mental health isn't a destination you reach. It's something you build, and Grow makes that easier. Grow connects you with thousands of high-quality licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions, nights and weekends. You can search by what matters, like insurance, specialty, identity, or availability, and get started in as little as 2 days. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. The therapist you want takes your insurance on Grow. Grow accepts over 125 insurance plans. Sessions average $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/book now today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/book now. growtherapy.com/book now. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
China, Cuba, America's growing problem with communist infiltration. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. If you haven't been paying attention, you may have missed this new report put out by the U.S. Department of State alleging decades of Cuban communist infiltration into the United States. As predicted, the leftists in the media mock. The sane reporters in journalism report this with alarm, just for a yin-yang, black and white type of comparison. This from The Intercept, their headline: Rubio's, meaning Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Rubio's paranoid Cuba report designed to, quote, justify a military attack on Cuba. Then flip over to Fox News. Rubio warns Cuba has infiltrated U.S. with spies, and then calls out the communist regime. It's just, look at the difference in the media. You would think that American media could at the very least be for America first and then report on facts dealing with our communist adversaries. But no, that's just too much to ask for in today's media. You have to get all the communist apologists in the media come out and slam not Cuba for infiltrating America and spreading its communist rot into America, not criticizing that, but rather criticizing Marco Rubio because he is paranoid about this communist infiltration into America. Well, he's not the only one who is paranoid about it, not the only one who is disturbed by it. There are a whole host of Americans who have watched rapidly the Democrat Party morph from pro-America, different in policy than Republicans, Democrats, to hate America, destroy America, disguise their communist and socialist roots in America, Democrats. That's how quickly the party of the left has swung. And if members of the media think that patriotic Americans are just going to give up their so-called paranoia about communism and infiltration of far-leftist anti-American interests in America, well, they have another thing coming, because there are way too many people left in America to this day who not only are watching the Democrat Party implode, right, but are glad to see it doing so, because it means sooner or later the Democrats are going to have to deal with their socialist communist infiltrations and either disband as a party and start a new one, or boot out the socialists and communists from their party. Either way, conservatives win. Before I get into more of this, I'd like to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app. At Real Life Network, that is the faith-based news outreach of Pastor Jack Hibbs's Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills Church in California. Check out all the podcasts and video news shows they have there. I'm happy to say Bold and Blunt has been among its esteemed lineup for years now. They have great shows giving you a faith perspective of all the madness that's taking place in this world at the hands by a large degree to the Democrats. But you may also get Bold and Blunt at WashingtonTimes.com, where if you scroll to the bottom of the main webpage and click on the newsletter section, click on it and find the best of Cheryl Chumley and enter your email address. You'll get delivered right to your email box. My commentaries, my Bold and Blunt audio and video versions, and it'll just be a happy week for you. You sit down at your desk for lunch and you open your email to catch up on your email, and there you see the best of Cheryl Chumley, catch up on your news and get all the talking points you need to fight the far left. You may also get Bold and Blunt wherever podcasts are available. This is a 100-page report that came out, just in the last few weeks. Cuba, the capital of 21st century communism, prepared by the State Department. And if you haven't read it, honestly, you should take a few minutes and look through it. Let me just read to you, I'm not going to read to you certainly 100 pages, but let me just read to you the table of contents first, and then I'll jump to the conclusion section and give you an idea of what the State Department has found under Secretary Marco Rubio. The revolutionary state, that's the first chapter. Birth of a new left, exporting revolution, which is what Cuba has been doing, right, for decades, as it turns out. The next chapter, an espionage empire. One of the greatest countries, one of the greatest exporters of communism countries, turns out. Revolutionary tourism. Racial revolution. Geez, that sounds familiar, right? The race wars in America, Barack Obama, divide and conquer. Everything had to do with race under him, DEI and wokeism. My goodness. Just sped up, fast forwarded through America's policy and culture, and then, pushed ever further ahead by Joe Biden. And now we're at this point in this country where many people believe that the very foundations of our nation are racist because centuries ago, those who penned the Constitution, some owned slaves. Well, guess what? Blacks owned slaves too, but we don't want to talk about that, do we? No. Chapter 7, Front Groups and Fellow Travelers, Anti-American Internationalism, and let's just jump to the conclusion. Like I said, you got to go through this report. It's eye-opening, and it's very important to be up to date on this kind of stuff. If you're an American who believes in the founding ideals of our country, you got to keep an eye on the threats to our country so you're equipped, first and foremost, with awareness and education to fight the threats effectively. All right, here's some from this conclusion. Castro kept his promise. Speaking of Fidel Castro in 1958, when he penned and promised a much wider and bigger war against the United States. All right, so Castro kept his promise. Reading from this report now, for 67 years, the Cuban regime has waged that campaign on every front. It has armed guerrillas, trained terrorists, sheltered fugitives, infiltrated the U.S. government, cultivated generations of American elites, built influence networks inside our institutions, and opened the Western Hemisphere to a succession of hostile foreign powers. It has sought to undermine, degrade, and destabilize America with spies and soldiers but also with students and intellectuals, with terrorist cells, but also with solidarity committees and nonprofit networks, with intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, but also with ostensibly private exchanges, nonprofits, political organizations, and activist networks. Isn't that interesting? Because, you just look at the nonprofits that have come to light under President Donald Trump since he's taken over the White House in a second term, and you see just how these leftist operatives use something like U.S. aid and tax dollar supported outreach to other nations, how they weave their tentacles and dig their claws into just one little program in America, and then multiply that by how many nonprofits, how many charitable organizations, how many 501c whatever does America have that does work overseas, that does work within our own borders. And just think how many of those organizations have been infiltrated by the likes of Cuban communist propagandists. All you have to do really is look at the streets and the rallies against President Donald Trump and read the signs that are being waved in the wind, read the poster boards, read the banners, and you can identify all these groups, all these partnerships, all these, as this State Department report puts it, solidarity committees and solidarity organizations and nonprofit networks. And you can just see it's mind-boggling, right? Back to the report. This is what makes Cuba unique. Other hostile regimes have stolen American secrets, financed terrorism, armed proxies, spread propaganda, or sought to cultivate political influence inside the United States. Cuba did and does all these things and more, but the Cuban regime has never recognized the neat distinctions that so often structure the American government's understanding of foreign threats. To Havana, there is no hard line separating these functions. It has integrated all of them into a single revolutionary project around which every single facet and function of the Cuban state is organized. Today, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, Cuban agents and operatives maintain a foothold in hundreds of front groups, activist organizations, solidarity centers, and ideological NGO and nonprofit networks. Just a couple more lines. These groups collectively represent one of the single largest, most sophisticated and dangerous vectors for hostile foreign influence in modern American history. Many of the most significant upheavals in recent American political history, from the George Floyd riots to the rise of Antifa to the explosion of pro-terrorist activism on American college campuses, I would add to that, anti-Semitic activism on college campuses. All that can be linked in some way, shape, or form to Cuban influence. So go back to The Intercept's headline, Rubio's Paranoid Cuba Report, designed to justify a military attack on Cuba. Or maybe, I don't know, editors and writers at The Intercept, it's designed to educate the American public on the rapidly growing, it seems lately, but under Cuban control, it's been decades in coming, the growing influence of communism in America. That's not paranoia. That's fact-based. And it's a fact-based danger that Americans need to open their eyes wide to so that we can properly deal with it. Communism and the Constitution cannot coexist. Communism and individualism, individual freedoms cannot coexist. Communism and ultimately God cannot coexist. Forget the whole idea of God-given rights and liberties that is basically the summation of American exceptionalism. It's the definition of American exceptionalism. The idea that each and every individual bestowed at birth with certain unalienable rights among life, liberty, pursuit of happiness granted by the Creator, governments in America only put in place to secure what's already given at birth, what is already God-given, and then along comes a communist spider and sits down beside her, right? You can't have that spider living happily with citizens who know their rights come from God, because communists' whole intent with government is to grow it so big and burdensome and make all people under its control, under its boot, rely on it for just basic human necessities, that there is no room for individualism. Zoran Mamdani spelled it out pretty bluntly. He talked about no longer would we need individualism, we would have the warmth of collectivism. So he recognizes the biggest battle going on in America right now is that of individualism versus collectivism, that of God-given individual rights and liberties versus the idea of government-granted rights and liberties. And when we're talking government-granted rights and liberties, the word for that is communism. So everybody in America right now should be looking at this 100-page report. You don't have to read it all in one sitting, but at least start with the conclusion and then scroll through it. Or if you don't have time for that, at least read some of these headlines and these news stories out there about it, because this is a very important report, and it shows that communism from China, we're aware of that problem, but communism from Cuba, let's not forget, Cuba's a lot closer, right? They're just a hop, skip, and very short boat ride to our American soil. And as the State Department report shows, they have been taking full advantage of that proximity for decades now. And alongside Cuba's communism in America, of course, we have to look at China's growing communism in America. They are playing the long game. The CCP over there is playing the long game. And I have with me today Michael Lucci. He is the CEO of State Armor, and his organization has really dug deep and found some very interesting information about one of the CCP's most successful way of wedging itself into America's politics and culture. Environmentalism, right? And there are too many groups in America here that are doing business with those in China, failing to recognize that when they do business with those in China, they're actually doing business with the Communist Party. Michael Lucci, I want to thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. So great to have you here.
Cheryl, thank you so much for having me on. And we're addressing a very important topic, which is that energy security is national security. And too many American organizations have engaged with Communist China in a way that benefits them and benefits their industries and significantly harms American industries. And that's what we looked at in our recent report, Environmental Law Institute in Communist China.
So let's start with your title and where you work, CEO of State Armor. What is State Armor, first off?
State Armor is a nonprofit organization that works state by state to, drive out the influence of the Chinese Communist Party in our critical infrastructure, where they're pre-positioning to cause, candidly, destruction in our state institutions, including our universities and our legislatures, where Chinese Communist Party agents are very often interfering with legislative processes, research security, stealing intellectual property, and also with state supply chain. So we work state by state on these problems, but then we also engage in broader investigations like the one we're highlighting today, where we look at how they capture certain institutions that have great strategic importance to both the United States and to China.
So this is what you do. This is your area of focus. This is what you are an expert in researching, investigating, and uncovering. And I was looking through some of the information that you have just found. Talk a little bit about, as you mentioned, your recent report.
So our recent report studies an Environmental Law Institute, which is an American-based nonprofit that has substantial operations and ties in communist China, including to some of their most dangerous government entities, military entities, and universities tied to the party, the intelligence state, and really the entire party apparatus in communist China. Environmental Law Institute has run what we describe as a dual-track program for environmental regulations in the United States and in China at the same time. They've been operating in China for about 3 decades. Over that time, everyone knows China's emissions have just grown in a gargantuan volumes of pollution, carbon emissions, and everything that ELI says that they're focused on. But ELI has been, basically a cheerleader of China throughout all this time, while we're running operations within the United States to make it very difficult for energy producers and the industrial manufacturers that we need to counter China's, large defense industrial base and manufacturer industrial base. So we looked at the different ties they have, which is kind of a who's who of party state apparatus, including what is the Chinese Supreme Court. Your listeners should understand that any court in China is underneath the party. So the party dictates to the court. It's not like our system. But they go as high as to the Chinese Supreme Court, different Chinese universities that are involved in environmental regulation. And they're basically providing the Chinese side with intelligence on what the United States is doing and what the Europeans are doing on environmental regulations, which China for decades has been exploiting what we've been doing on environmental regulations by selling us technologies such as solar products that have kill switches in them. And this isn't some right-wing talking point. This is the Washington Post in December of last year reporting that the Chinese solar technologies coming into the United States have kill switches controlled by China's government that can use to cause blackouts across the country. So they know where we're going on environmental regulation, and they're getting in front of it, and they're selling us products that are extremely dangerous, and they're going to our grid all over the country. Meanwhile, the same group, ELI, they've trained over 2,000 judges within the United States on really radical environmental theories of how we should punish our energy producers in our industrial economy for emissions that occur here, when over in China, they kind of wave away all China's emissions, which are multiples of ours and are growing much more rapidly than ours. So there's this dual track approach where they kind of provide information, intelligence, and expertise to the Chinese side, and they expect no changes. China does nothing to improve their environmental situation. But then on our side, they're imposing strict controls on our industries that punish our economy.
So who exactly or what exactly is ELI? If I go to ELI's web pages and look up who are the players behind the scene, am I going to find all Chinese names, or what's going on here?
No, you won't find. They partner with Chinese entities in China, but these are largely American individuals who are running ELI. They're going over to China and they're partnering with China. But these are folks who've been in the Obama administration, kind of liberal activists on environmental issues. They're just American folks who partner with China on these issues. So they're providing legal training and they're providing incentives for litigation against energy producers in the United States. So that's kind of a core competency that they deliver is, I would say, punishing the American economy. But then they're providing different intelligence and briefings and expertise and knowledge over in China. Of course, they interact with law firms that describe themselves as law firms that please the party, the Chinese Communist Party. They interact with the Chinese legal system up to and including Supreme Court judges there. They interact with universities over there, providing all the intelligence, know-how, and expertise from the American and European side. But the people involved in this are not Chinese nationals. They interact with Chinese nationals, but this is an American nonprofit I would contrast it with another American nonprofit, Energy Foundation China, which is causing very similar problems. But Energy Foundation China actually, even though it's supposedly it's a San Francisco-based nonprofit, a lot of their staff is actually in Beijing and spread across China. And they do a lot of similar things. Energy Foundation China, they kind of advocate to punish American energy producers and the industrial economy here while shielding China from those same regulations.
So what you describe, I mean, it sounds almost like treasonous behavior. But you said that they've been in operation for about 30 years now, ELI. So how do they dodge any type of accusations along those lines? What legal loopholes are they exploiting?
Well, the legal loophole, I think that's a really good question. We have nonprofits across the United States of all different types that act directly contrary to our national interests. I would argue ELI is definitely one of those. They're not the only example, unfortunately. So the legal loophole, in a sense, is we provide tax-exempt status to organizations that damage our national security. That's exactly what we're arguing ELI does. And then we are not imposing transparency requirements when they engage with a foreign adversary. There are leaders involved with ELI who have argued that we should not even consider Communist China a foreign adversary. Now, this is the same Chinese Communist Party that is the number one cause of death for military-age men in America through an intentional fentanyl operation that's been going on for decades. It's the same CCP that is threatening really all of its neighbors, our allies in Japan, our allies in the Philippines, our allies in South Korea. ELI has had leaders argue that we shouldn't even consider them an adversary, despite all the things that they do in our country and then in the Pacific region. And so the loophole, so to speak, is that there isn't any requirement that you have to stop damaging our national security as a nonprofit organization. That's definitely something that should be looked at. But what we're also calling for in the report is we think that Congress really needs to investigate these relationships. So we know largely what they do on the American side. We argue, of course, that it's very harmful to our energy economy and our industrial economy here, which we now realize we really need to build up because China is threatening us in many ways. We need much more transparency on what they're doing in communist China, which is what we're calling for, investigating and calling for in this report. Because those ties are often very murky and very dangerous, even if ELI doesn't realize it. They are interacting with Chinese intelligence across the board. I mean, everything they interact with in China, whether it's universities, the state, or law firms that claim that they are loyal to the party, everything they interact with is bound by Chinese law to engage in intelligence operations against ELI and against the United States. And so there's an incredible naivete by ELI. And then there's just broad loopholes in the sense that we have nonprofits all over the United States that candidly act against our strategic interests. ELI is one of them. Foreign agent registration is something that should be considered here. But more broadly, Congress should investigate ELI and other organizations that are so clearly acting contrary to American national interests, getting in bed with our greatest adversary and producing outcomes where China's pollution and emissions just continue to skyrocket while the United States energy producers get punished in court every day.
So I was going to bring up Congress and ask you what type of feedback you may have received from them, because it sounds to me a little bit akin to what Senator Marsha Blackburn has been investigating with the Neville Roy Singham group, the pro-Chinese group, businessman, you know, you've heard of him, the billionaire businessman who advances communist interests in America. And that organization, he's under investigation. So are you saying that ELI should face similar scrutiny from Congress? I assume you are. And if so, what kind of feedback have you received?
Well, we have called for exactly that. We've asked for the intelligence committees in both chambers, along with the House Select Committee on Chinese Communist Party, to look into the ELI organization. The CCP Select Committee is the first that's made a public commentary, and I don't want to overstate state what they said because they're just starting to look into this. But the chairman, John Molinar, said that American organizations should be extremely careful about engaging in United Front organizations, which are essentially Chinese intelligence organizations, while at the same time advocating for policies in the United States that are detrimental to our security. And he warned that one of the things ELI does is continuing education in the legal space related to environmental policy and law. He warned that American organizations that are looking for continuing legal education should be very skeptical of organizations that are so clearly tied to the Chinese Communist Party, which is what we're arguing that ELI is. So the report is new. The chairman's statements are new. Of course, anything takes time in Congress, and that's what we hope begins now. And we are optimistic that that's going to be the case, that Congress and perhaps executive agencies are going to look at the outcomes that ELI is producing and say, hey, these are contrary to the national security interests of the United States. We need to know more about what you're doing with the Chinese Communist Party beyond what's in State Armor's report. I think that what's in our report is egregious. I mean, why would you ever partner with Chinese military entities, Chinese intelligence entities, the Chinese university system on these environmental policies when they have no interest in going along with America wants to do? They have zero interest in that. Why would you partner with them? It's inexplicable. And then here on the home front, they're damaging our major energy producers through lawfare, through coordinated legal attacks, and through training judges to have really the most detrimental view possible of our energy producers here, which is that we should attribute, bad weather events and other things like this to specific energy producers and then punish them in the courtroom for that.
It just seems like nowadays, everywhere you look, there's Chinese influence seeping into America's culture, economy, education system, politics. And President Donald Trump has come out and said that communism is the greatest threat our nation is facing right now. It seems to me the time's right to have this organization looked into.
Obviously, we think that's the case, but I think that your broader point is extremely important. You mentioned Neville Roy Singham. We have also called for investigations of him. I mean, he operates in the same building as a Chinese Communist Party propaganda agency in Shanghai. But what Americans, I think, should broadly understand about the Chinese Communist Party, and it applies to most communist entities, is that they become propaganda superpowers, infiltration and subversion superpowers. So what the Marxist-Leninist approach is, and ELI, CCP, what they're trying to do is they're trying to sap America's strengths, undermine us internally, and then sort of extract America's strengths to use for their party interests. This is actually a very specific strategy that they've candidly, done quite effectively over decades now. I mean, they've been stealing intellectual property. They've been undermining us internally. And I think that your point is extremely important. We have to recognize communism as the existential threat that it's always been. Globally, the CCP is the leader of the communist movement. The country itself is kind of mixed, but the government is a communist entity. They are Marxist-Leninists. They are truly that. We have to recognize how they infiltrate us. ELI is one example. We have to counter that. And we have to chop off these tentacles of infiltration, subversion, and extraction of American ingenuity and economic development.
And let me just finish with this one question, Michael. Is there any chance at all that ELI is not aware of its anti-American agenda here?
I'm extremely skeptical of that. President Trump in his first term, President Biden in his term, and then President Trump again now have all categorized the Chinese Communist Party as our number one adversary, our number one global strategic threat. This is something that has generally unified Democrats and Republicans. For ELI to go over to China and claim that they don't realize that the Chinese Communist Party is the threat that is a bipartisan position in Washington, D.C. and across the country as well, I don't think anyone can be that blind. I think that what their best argument is they think that by engaging with China, we're going to, change them or something like this or improve them. That argument has failed every single time. What communism does is they suck away your strengths. They take from ELI what they can, and then they would undoubtedly try to use ELI as a vector to harm the United States. And that's what we say needs to be investigated. Of course, the CCP would take whatever know-how and expertise and training they could get from ELI, but then they would turn around and use that as a vector to try to harm the United States as well. They've done this. I mean, George Soros, of all people, recognized that that's what the Chinese Communist Party does, and he pulled his operations out of China. He does a lot of things in a lot of places. He pulled out of China because he said it's so impossible to operate there without being, commandeered and used by the party itself. If Soros thinks that China is impossible to operate in because the entire intelligence apparatus just undermines whatever you're trying to do, how do any of these other guys think that they're going to break through rather than actually being subverted themselves? And that's what we think needs to be investigated here.
I don't think there's any better way to show how shocking it is by what you just said about George Soros. I really appreciate your organization looking into this, looking into China, but looking into this specifically, and for putting it on my radar. Michael Lucci, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt.
Thank you for having me on.
And that's another Bold and Blunt. Remember, if you'd like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at Real Life Network, at WashingtonTimes.com, and of course, wherever podcasts are available. Tune in next time. In the meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.